A very good evening to you all and welcome to Rwanda Television News with me, Sam Kalisa. President Paul Kagame says that the COVID-19 pandemic has destabilized health sectors in many of the African countries, plus exposing their weaknesses. Speaking at the conference on the impact of COVID-19 on Africa, organized by the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, President Paul Kagame, on the other hand, said the pandemic has revealed hidden potential that the continent has built on. The head of state highlighted on the gap Africa has in regards to the coronavirus fighting battle. I quote, "One of the big gaps is that Africa does not produce significant quantities of medical supplies. The real solution is to prioritize manufacturing in Africa. The new continental free trade area, Africa, makes this even more attractive for investors," President Paul Kagame said. The head of state said that though the COVID-19 pandemic confronted global development programs in general, what is needed to make Africa a stronger and faster economy as it was before the COVID-19 pandemic is more relevant today. This includes urban development, technology and tourism. Regarding health investment, President Paul Kagame said that everyone should feel that it is the right thing to do and that it should help everyone achieve their priorities. I quote, "We need healthy populations. We need healthy institutions to be able to do whatever else we need to do that is a priority," the head of state said. In addition to the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the Twitter account of the President's office indicated that the participants included the Director General of the World Trade Organization and the Director of the African Centers of Disease Control and Prevention. Into other matters now, the Minister of Infrastructure, Ambassador Clever Gatete, told the senators that the reform in expropriation, better planning and ensuring that no civil rights are infringed on their property is the key to ending the problem of untimely compensation. Jen Mutoni has this report.
Across the country, there has been issues of people not getting proper compensation for their properties that were destroyed during constructions of public infrastructure, such as roads. However, the law on expropriation enacted in 2015 stipulates that every citizen who is about to be relocated or whose property is going to be affected for public benefit activities must first receive the appropriate compensation. Some claim that after their properties were assessed in terms of value, they have not yet been paid for quite some time. Their wish is for these transactions to be done sooner.
We don't get to sleep when it rains. We constantly have to move our things so that they don't get swept away by the floods. If only they were to give us the money for compensation sooner so that we can find another place to live in, then that would be great.
Compensation issues were addressed by the chairperson of the Senatorial Committee on Economic Development and Finance, Juvenal Musi, to the Senate General Assembly.
When relocating people, there should be documents which indicate which parts of hectares are being constructed on roads, and this should be followed up by the authorities.
The Minister of Infrastructure, Honorable Clever Gatete, said that while the compensation issue is still being felt in various places, especially in areas of road construction and expansion, there are promising measures to address it.
We have the final list of those who are to receive their compensations by this April, which means in the next budget, these compensations shall be prioritized. We've agreed with the ministry in charge of land and the local government that while doing the expropriation, they should carry out survey which will then indicate the parts of the land that will belong to the government and offer new documents to the owners which indicate all the details.
Minister Gatete admitted to the Senate that the issues related to providing adequate compensation to the people does exist, but that the strategy to address them remains to determine in advance where the people will live by settling the budget for compensation earlier and enumerating roadside buildings that could be disrupted during road construction. Regarding the issue of water from the road that could destroy houses, Minister Gatete said that in the process of improving the construction of the road, attention will be paid to the buildings that are likely to be damaged, hence a budget will be put in place to compensate for them as well. Jane Mutoni reporting for RTV.
Thank you, Jen, for that report. Now, into other matters, Zigama Credit and Savings Society, Zigama CSS, has announced a net profit of 13.7 billion for the year 2020. It is an increase from 11 billion recorded as net profit in the year 2019. This was communicated during a General Assembly held today at the Defense Headquarters in Kimihurura. The meeting was chaired by Honorable Minister of Defense, Major General Albert Murasira, and attended by Minister of Justice Johnston Businje, Chief of Defense Staff, General Jean Bosco Kazura, as well as service chiefs and heads of security organs, and selected list of members. During the meeting, Zigama CSS leadership, headed by its chairman, Board of Director Dr. James Ndahiro, expressed optimism for its development despite the COVID-19 pandemic that affected the country's financial status in general. Zigama and of course, this is thanks to the guidance of His Excellency Paul Kagame, the President of the Republic of Rwanda and Commander-in-Chief of Rwanda Defense Force, who advised the cooperative to invest in digitalization and IT earlier in 2005.
All that we registered for the last year as interest was mainly due to the use of IT services. Members were quick to embrace the technology, and this has helped to positively sustain the bank. We recommend the guidance received from the Commander-in-Chief, who emphasized that we should invest in digitalization and IT systems. It was the best way to go, and we realized that especially during this COVID-19 pandemic.
Zigama CSS continues to expand the use of IT services such as mobile money, mobile application, ATM, USSD, SMS message to facilitate its members for different transactions. Zigama CSS is a financial cooperative with membership drawn mainly from security organs, namely Rwanda Defense Force, Rwanda National Police, Rwanda Correctional Services, National Security Services, and the Rwanda Investigation Bureau. And of course, heading into other matters, Pan-Africanism has for so long been regarded as the best drive for Africa's development. And it is in this regard, right here in RBA studios, we're gladly joined by Ahmed Bening, the Secretary General of the Pan-African Union. Sir, we're glad to have you this evening in our studios.
Thank you.
How does Pan-African Union support the youth? Starting from this.
So, thank you so much. Thanks for having me on your show. If you know, the Pan-African Youth Union is the coordinating institution for national youth councils. That means that fundamentally we coordinate the activities of national youth councils and the implementation of the Africa Youth Charter. The Africa Youth Charter is the continental blueprint or continental policy that guides youth mainstreaming on the continent. Right. So every country is supposed to domesticate that into a national youth policy that's supposed to guide the development process. So for us, we effectively coordinate that and its implementation.
Right. And of course, talking about leadership and the youth, how do we create space for these youth, especially in Africa, for those who are politically, who want to be politically inclusive? How do we give them space, or how do we create space for them?
I think that it's not about creating space for young people. It's about young people themselves recognizing their strength, their potential. On the African continent, 70% of the overall population is made up of young people below 35 years. That means that for every country, young people have got what it takes to determine the political status quo.
All right.
The question should be, do we recognize that potential as young people? And are we taking advantage of our numbers to direct the development trajectory of our countries or the continent? That should be the continent. That should be actually our preoccupation as young people.
All right.
In terms of spaces, I believe that once the advocacy is led by young people, every government, every country would recognize that potency and would follow suit.
And absolutely, you just mentioned about the numbers. As we talk right now, Africa has the youngest population in the world, with more than 400 million young people aged between 15 to 35. And of course, with the Agenda 2063 in mind, what role can they play in the flagship programs of this Agenda 2063?
Often I have said that as young people, we cannot wait to be given an opportunity to be involved in the development processes of this continent or in our respective countries. The Agenda 2063 is a 50-year blueprint. Those leading the continent now may not be alive in 50 years. That means that as young people, we have a responsibility of taking the development of this continent as a responsibility.
Right.
Now, that means that as young people, if we want to create an integrated, prosperous, and secured continent,
All right,
our role should be taking leadership roles in agriculture, in IT, in entrepreneurship, ensuring that our governments do not mortgage the natural resources of this continent to the Chinese, to the Europeans, and to the Americans, but ensuring that they scale up policy that will ensure that all the natural resources that we have on this continent is appropriated to our collective benefit.
all right.
That means that we must start by taking advantage over the manufacturing and processing sectors of this continent.
Right.
I have always raised this issue about land policy on the continent, because the next big thing on this continent is agriculture. And if we are supposed to take advantage of the agribusiness on this continent, the arable land on this continent, we need to sit with our governments. We need to start that advocacy of ensuring that governments actually put in place the appropriate land policy and land tenure system so young people can access the land, so they can use it. The gold, the coffee, the cocoa, the diamonds. We as young people must begin to bring our sense of ingenuity on how to transform these into finished products, either than mortgaging and signing off concessions to companies that are non-African and they move their raw material outside the continent. So I believe that if we are talking about really accomplishing the objectives of Agenda 2063, we as young people must rise to the occasion. We must hold our governments across the continent to make sure that the resources of this continent is used judiciously, and that includes how conscientized we are as young people.
All right.
And I believe that once we proceed on this trajectory, this continent will be prosperous.
Absolutely, sir. We're talking about what needs to be done by the African youth, but where do we still lag behind? Where is the gap?
I think that the fundamentally the gap is the kind of mentality that we have. If you meet 100 young people on the streets of Kigali or the streets of Lagos or Accra, they believe that progress and success is in Europe and in America. They don't recognize the real value of the wealth that we have on the African continent. Reality is that in the Europe and the Americas, for them to live the kind of life that they have right now, they need to depend on the natural resources of this continent. So the way to move this continent is to ensure that we sit back in this continent, ensure that we bring our sense of ingenuity to harness the productive resources of this continent. And I just said, the productive resources of this continent, the land is one, the mineral resources, the mineral wealth of this continent is another. So young people should not necessarily focus attention on just politics, because when we talk about leadership and development, young people assume that you must be the president of a country or you must be a member of parliament to be in charge.
All right.
You can be a leader in agriculture, you can be a leader in IT, you can be a leader in entrepreneurship.
All right.
That is the way we harness the potential of the continent. That is the way to achieve the aspirations of Agenda 2063.
And so, as you're talking about this, about the opportunities the youth have to explore, the African Continental Free Trade Area agreements, among others, have been signed and is now into action. But how best should the youth deal with the challenges available, of course, in exploring the opportunities available for the African continent?
So the bigger challenge of Africa Continental Free Trade really is not about the document that's been signed. It's about the commitment of our governments to operationalizing that. You don't sign an Africa Free Trade whilst other countries are signing new deals with the UK, while countries are signing the economic partnership agreement with Europe. Because really, the potential that the CFTA presents to this continent is the 1.2 billion people on this continent. That is a huge market. That is the market China wants to break into. That is the market Europe wants to break into. So what are African companies doing trying to break into the European market when you have 1.2 billion people on the continent?
All right.
That's what young people must focus attention on. The issue of visas. You don't sign a continental free trade agreement, rectify it, and you start the operationalization. And a businessman from Rwanda would require a visa to go to Nigeria. A businessman in Nigeria would require a visa to go to South Africa. These are the things that we need to begin to break down if we actually want to take advantage of the enormous potential that the CFTA presents. And so that brings the young people and the governments to the table again to say, young startups, our interest is not Europe, China, and the Americas. Right. Our interest is the 1.2 billion people on the African continent. Absolutely. Because if you look at our trade between Africa and Europe or China, our exports, we import more than we export. Now that means that the consumer base of the African continent requires a lot more than we produce. The manufacturing sector of the African continent is centered in just 5 countries.
All right.
South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, Algeria, Morocco. The rest of the countries, what are we doing? So we need to take advantage of the scale of the CFTA so that we can build businesses that are resilient and then can meet the needs of the African continent.
Absolutely. And so finally, in your opinion, is Africa's future safe and is it in good hands, of course, in regards to the challenges available? For instance, you just talked about a big number of African youth who run to other continents to search for what they call good pasture. Is our future safe?
I think that young people on the continent, including some governments, are making significant progress in terms of good governance and how we take our countries. Rwanda is a clear example of the kind of governance that we have always required and the kind of transformation that we have always required on the continent. But fast forward, you can't be talking about the security and safety of a continent when we have so many wars on the continent, when South Sudan is destabilized, when Congo is not peaceful, when northern Nigeria has its own crisis, when the Sahel is in crisis. Of course, if poverty in majority of African countries continue to linger on and young people do not see any hope in terms of the policy mechanisms of government to create safe spaces within the economic sector for them, of course, the dejection would exist. But I'm confident that the new African young person is beginning to realize that you go to Europe, there's nothing to do there. The real deal is Africa. You go to America, there's nothing to do there. So for those that have had an opportunity to travel to Europe and to the Americas, they know that it is easier to make life. It is easier to build a business on the African continent than going to Europe and the Americas. And I'm confident that once we begin to change our mindsets, we begin to hold our government and systems accountable, and we begin to advocate for the scaling up of policy, be it youth policy, economic policy, this continent will be a place to live, and I'm confident that we would achieve an integrated, prosperous Africa.
Thank you very much, sir, for your time.
Thank you for having me.
And of course, moving on into justice matters in the case that involves Paul Rusesabagina and the 20 co-accused, the prosecution presented the High Court Chamber for International and Cross-Border Crimes testimony, documents, audio and video evidence that the MRCD FLN terrorist activities were known to Paul Rusesabagina and that he supported them.
This Thursday, April 1st, 2021, the prosecution continued to present to the court evidence related to the crimes of financing terrorism, which had been adjourned at the hearing of Thursday. The prosecution further presented to the court the telephone text conversation between Paul Rusesabagina and Brigadier General Antoine Hachizimana, alias Jeva, the commander of MLCD FLN militia in the northeastern province of the Democratic Republic of Congo, pointing out that the militants had been cut off from food supply after the attacks by the Congolese National Forces, which had removed them from their base. Jeva also gave Rusesabagina a report on how the fighting was going, and Paul Rusesabagina replied that they were not sitting idle while looking for all the support needed. In other charts extracted from MLCD WhatsApp group, its treasurer Eric Munyemana told party members, including Paul Rusesabagina, that there was nothing left in their coffers and that in 2019 they had spent more than 150,000 euros on purchasing weapons to MLCD FLN fighters and to help them get other logistical upkeep while on the battlefield. The telephone conversation were extracted from Paul Rusesabagina's phone seized during a search at his house in Brussels, Belgium, where police seized various documents, a telephone and a computer. On the charge of murder as an act of terrorism, the prosecution presented evidence from MLCD FLN attacks in Nyamimata in Nyaruguru district and in Chitabi and Nyungwe in Nyamagabe district, where 9 people were killed. The evidence on these murders included testimony from eyewitnesses and one victim who was shot and later died, who told investigators that vehicles and motorbikes were set on fire at the scene before gunmen opened fire at people in the area. On the charge of abduction as an act of terrorism, the prosecution alleges that MLCD FLN fighters had been kidnapping people from their homes or even vehicles and taking them to Nyungwe Forest. On the charge of armed robbery as an act of terrorism, witnesses testified that MLCD FLN fighters robbed them of their crops, livestock, telephone and even ordered them to carry the stolen goods. The prosecution told the court that Paul Rusesabagina was guilty of these crimes, although he was not present at the scene, as he was the chairperson of the MLCD FLN armed group and its main sponsor. After all, he claimed in a video interview the deadly attacks on Rwandan territory right after they had happened. The trial is set to resume on April 21st and 22nd, with the prosecution presenting evidence of the remaining 3 charges against Paul Rusesabagina, who has not returned to court from the time he announced that he will not appear in court again. Reporting for RwandaTV News, Ethan Tashobia.
Thank you, Tashobia, for that report. This Thursday, the Minister of Justice appeared before the Chamber of Deputies to explain to lawmakers what the government is doing to reduce litigation losses as well as mismanagement of taxpayers' money. Ethan Tashobia continues.
The Parliamentary Public Accounts Committee has cited some examples of what would be avoidable cases of mismanagement of public resources and unnecessary state litigation by various government agencies, according to the Auditor General's report. Among them include the University of Rwanda, which paid 68 million Rwandan francs as a fine of late payment of taxes to the Rwanda Revenue Authority, WASAC, which paid more than 53 million Rwandan francs in litigation and non-disclosure of taxes, while Rwanda Education Board paid 30 million Rwandan francs to employers in litigation. This is due to improper decision taken by some of the authorities, according to Muhakwa Valence, the chairperson of the Public Accounts Committee. It was revealed that some leaders take wrong decisions that lead to state litigation and consequent losses, or some public property valuers tend to inflate values and lead to losses. Deputies say managers should take into account recommendations of the legal experts for various public institutions to avoid unnecessary losses and litigations. In its second quarter report of the year 2020-2021, the Ministry of Justice submitted to the Prime Minister a report indicating that the government has so far recovered 5 billion Rwandan francs, while 10.5 billion Rwandan francs remain to be paid. The Ministry of Justice says that it is now stepping up its effort to recover public assets and debts in collaboration with law enforcers. The government won 117 cases out of 152 litigation cases, while the rest of litigations were lost. I wouldn't say that the loss was as a result of poor judgment from the judiciary. Public agencies must make sure their contracts fulfill all legal obligations, and there are so many contracts they enter into. It is a step that we must work together to be where we want to be. The Justice Minister Johnston Busingye also said that there is a partnership with various agencies, including Rwanda Revenue Authority, the Lands Agency and the Immigration Service, in order to seize property of those who have failed to repay.
Now, women's rights groups call on Rwandan society to value the courage of to say no to sexual abuse. Jedumwali has the report.
Juliette Karitanye, a known feminist, finds that what has been circulating on social media for days seems to discourage those who dare to say that they have been abused in recent years, arguing that it is inappropriate. One can be raped by a parent, a domestic worker, your own friend. People fail to accept that someone can choose to speak up about it now rather than then. We have to examine ourselves and grant victims the space and empathy they need. The rest is left to the justice system to do what they're supposed to do. On the other hand, there are those who criticize the way it is being used by some to show that they have been sexually abused over the years.
When a person posts it on Twitter, their problem is not solved, but they put pressure on the people. Otherwise, they should first find a community health worker or seek justice. I feel that it should come to social media if it fails, and maybe they have tried other institutions to no avail. After all, social media is a large place, and fighting in that space is a difficult thing.
According to some victims, sexual abuse is not easy to talk about, and the perpetrator has a significant impact on the victim. Uwanhega Patricia, who has been a victim for the past 10 years, says this causes the wound to heal slowly. A lot of grief came from speaking up because after I tried to talk to people, no one valued it. The fact that it happened to me and I talked about it, but no one believed me or valued my story, hurt more than I can express. Some members of the civil society, including a women's rights activist, continue to look at the progress made in the process of eradicating violence against women in accordance with the international conventions that Rwanda has signed. They find that the Rwandan society should change the way it responds to someone that is scared to talk about their experiences, regardless of the time they were abused.
Firstly, they are scared to speak up about it because they feel like they may not get justice. Secondly, they are boxed in. Thirdly, they fear the pushback. But there are times when one sees that they may get justice and not have to deal with the pushback, or when the person has people listening. When the time comes and a person is able to speak up, we should grant them that space and see how we can get justice for them.
These people who call them liars should stop judging them immediately, because the law is there and the law enforcers have the ability to find the truth according to the law. So when the victims find the courage to speak about it, whether it's true or not, we should not judge them. Civil society, in this regard, call for everyone's cooperation in eradicating the plight of those who have dared to speak out about the sexual abuse that has taken place in the past, and the mistreatment of the Rwandan community as a result of it. Umngari Jade, RTV News.
On behalf of the entire news and technical team that made it happen, thank you very much for being with us. My name is Sam Kalisa. Have a good evening.